Parra. Thank you for hitting the recording. Um, I am an experienced designer and accessibility specialist. So I've not only understand a lot about digital accessibility, but I also have the background of working with editorial layouts and complex PDFs and data visualization and data dashboards. And I know what it's like to be on a design team that has to think of a myriad of ways to deliver a desired output. And so, in the framing of this training today, we're thinking about the output of accessible PDFs by way of InDesign. So we're going to be toggling back and forth between these two ecosystems. Before diving in, I'm just curious to learn where everyone is at with what they understand so far of accessible PDFs. Like I know Mark has mentioned experience the adventure it is to tag PDFs for accessibility. But I'd love to get just a quick sense of the familiarity with everyone else. Have you started poking around with accessibility features? Is this more of an introduction for you? How do you feel? Starting with Paul, where are you at?
Oh, I have no experience with accessibility PDFs whatsoever, so I'm starting at the ground level. Most of my experience is with web, which is handled by mostly plugins.
Yeah,
So it does the work for me.
awesome. All right, that's good to know. Max and Nikki, how do you feel about it?
Also starting at zero. Yeah.
Starting at zero. Perfect.
I'm probably
Nikki?
starting at two. So I just did a dive into it a couple weeks ago, just learning how alt tags work for photos,
Yeah.
how it can do it automatically. And then I've learned the automatic feature isn't foolproof, and there'd be a number of pictures that don't have tags on them. So then I learned, okay, this is how you can create a tag for a photo. And that's basically where my knowledge ends.
Great. So you've got some touch points in there. Um, and that's great. I we this was designed to with an assumption that, maybe this is just a starting practice. So I'm going to give you a heads up about a few things. So I'm just going to share my entire screen because I want to toggle between what I have prepared to walk you through the steps. So I have the slide deck that I have is a PowerPoint, and you can also examine the PowerPoint if you want to as a reference guide, and it's also accessible. So if you want to look at that different format, sometimes I find as a designer who's working in the weeds, I like seeing examples of the real thing, right? So that's going to be provided. I've also designed it to be a quick reference, even though we're going to have a conversation about what conversations do we need to have as a design team, for example. Things are changing pretty quickly with plugins, Paul, you had mentioned, even accessibility features in InDesign and Acrobat. Adobe is doing some mobilization of accessibility too. So with this training that I'm showing you, this is how things are structured at this point in time. What I have found helpful in the last decade as accessibility has evolved over that time is having some solid reference anchor points. So I have included that in the resources section at the end of this deck I'll be sharing. And I encourage you to just have that reference tool, especially if you have access to Acrobat Pro. It has enhanced some of the features to explain issues, and it takes you directly to the reference. I'm also adding some resources with a reference that I personally really like to use, which is DQ University. So a lot of the things that I point to or will source in the resources bring you to open source options with the option to do a deep dive into advanced PDF accessibility if that's something you really want to jam on. So just giving you some flexibility there. Um, so with that, I'm going to share my screen so we can jump in. Thank you for letting me know where you all are at. It's very helpful to make sure that I'm not overdoing it. Okay, so let's see. So to start, um, okay, if I now that I'm going to share my whole screen, I won't be able to see you. So if you need to stop me or ask me a question, please feel free to interrupt me. All right. There we go. So are you all seeing a PowerPoint deck? All right. And is it at a good scale for you?
Oh yeah, it's great.
Perfect. Okay. Alrighty. So with any digital materials that I provide, I always do an accessibility check. We want to embody accessibility. So in the materials that I share with you, I've added alt text to images, checked the headlines, outline and reading order of the layouts, checked color contrast, and brief visual descriptions will be used for informational images. And a lot of this is going to be descriptive because we're talking about some technical dialogues within two ecosystems, notably InDesign and Acrobat Pro. So the way we designed this was really a conversation with Jesse, Mark, and the team, as well as looking at some sample documents to give us an idea of like what do we really need to understand with the documentation that Travel Oregon produces on a cyclical and routine basis. So we're going to start off with some foundations. A lot of this is going to be carried over from the previous training of authoring accessible documents. Some of these behaviors are similar with different outputs because InDesign just does so much more than these other tools like PowerPoint and Microsoft do. We'll glide into some alt text and image handling, and we're going to expand on different methods of image handling. We're going to touch on tables, and then we're going to talk about data visualizations and charts. And the reason why I've layered it like that is because there's some foundations that are good to know as we ratchet up to more complex imagery like data viz, including charts and maps and interactive PDFs. We're going to talk about exporting and tagging, how to do that, where to look, and how to check it, verifying accessibility in Acrobat, which is really helpful, different types of like documents that's integrated in the image handling as well. And we're going to be touching on accessibility within templates and fixing issues at the source, some vendor considerations with third party. We have some specific examples with Travel Oregon to think about as a design team. So we're covering a lot of territory. As mentioned before, I'm going to be doing some document demos. Mark, thank you so much for sending over InDesign files. I'm going to be referencing them and toggling between InDesign and Acrobat Pro in this presentation to give you a feel of the flow and some key considerations. If it gets disorienting at all, just let me know. All right, so with that, some of the foundations for accessibility is kind of what we talked about with the authoring accessible documents training. It's a really nice baseline. But with InDesign specifically, we're thinking about what can we actually do in that ecosystem, what the constraints are, and how does it port over into Acrobat Pro so we can finish it off and polish accessibility there. So as a recap, accessibility starts in the source file. So many of the Travel Oregon documents that we reviewed started off as like Word or PowerPoint and converted into PDF. So integrating accessibility early on in the process is really helpful. So something to think about with some key handoff moments is building that relationship with your content authors, right? You are a design team that is probably talking to a variety of people and extracting information. So understanding what can be ported over from their source material is really valuable and eases the friction throughout building and InDesign. And we'll touch more on that in a moment. So the mindset to keep in mind is that accessible authoring from the start means no remediation and no rework, just documents that work for everyone. Now, when you're in the design team, it's like we try to reduce remediation as much as possible, but the reality of our design flows is we do as much as we can in InDesign so that it makes it easy to check an Acrobat Pro, because some things can be missed. And it doesn't require a full-on remediation, but just some mindful checks. And that's what we're going to talk about and dive into today. So previously I'd mentioned that, the Travel Oregon team shared with me a collection of documents to evaluate with accessibility. I did a manual and semi-automated evaluation of those assets. And to no surprise to this team, you'll know that a lot of the assets end up as PDFs. That's why we are focusing so much on this specific InDesign to PDF workflow. We know that many of these assets include images and tables and images of tables. We'll talk about that too. Maps, and then usage of templates. So much of this training is hyper-focused in these areas. So just want to disclose that because, of course, there's so much more we can expand on with accessibility, but we're keeping it focused with what you are working on the most. So with that, my goal for us today is to adopt some accessibility health checks in your workflow currently, internally as a design team, and how you get requests from other teams, like if you operate on an intake form or specific team-to-team handoffs. This is where we start thinking about where those can happen. And then, of course, developing new export habits. So overall, as a design team, I recommend thinking about your accessibility strategy, right? So we already know that many of the documents are going to end up as PDFs. They're image rich. So when we are adopting an InDesign to PDF workflow, the decision that we're making as a design team is, okay, we're focused on a fixed layout. There will be some instances where it's more optimal to have a reflowable layout. So what that means is that if the content you are expecting to be more responsive or like be on an EPUB, right? It's really a decision of, is this final output going to be an EPUB or a PDF? And in this training, we're focusing on the PDF. But at the end, we're going to be talking about vendor considerations where it might be advantageous to think about your output being an EPUB, which follows similar protocols with some variations. So we'll touch on that. The other important thing about this training is we're going to see what accessibility factors can be done within InDesign versus what can be done in Acrobat Pro. And another conversation that is prompted through this training with design teams is building an ethos and an understanding of what you consider decorative versus informative. And this is really more key in the sense of not just in an internal design team, but collaborating with content authors and being very specific of what you need to ask of them, right? So we'll dive into specific examples in a moment about that, but it is a conversation that's going to happen if, for example, you don't have the time to build out a table in InDesign, so you're using a screenshot of a table instead. If you do that, then that's a conversation of, well, who is responsible for characterizing the alt text to describe that table? Is that on the design team? Does the design team have time to do all that? Or is it on the content author? So it helps us understand what information we need during the handoff process to smooth that transition. So you're not hunting information down when you're already in a production flow. So 2 quick references here. We're going to be covering a lot of this today. And the 2 things that we're not going to talk about as much because we've covered it in the previous training is like a deep dive into color contrast and paragraph styles, using them consistently. We kind of know that as an authoring document practice, so I'm not going to dive as deep into that. They will be referenced. In paragraph styles today, it's really attached to heading structure. We're going to focus in. Yeah.
Hi, sorry to interrupt. I didn't properly introduce the team here. So Mark is the only one who actually works for Travel Oregon. Everyone else are partners. And so I will definitely send them the training, but
Okay.
they haven't had the authoring documents training yet.
Gotcha.
So sorry about that. Nikki and Max are from Media America, and they help build our travel guides. And Paul has his own firm, and we work with him on tons of projects. So I just thought I should give you that reference that they actually haven't had that first training yet.
Okay, no, that's really great. Thank you, Jesse. No worries at all. So, what I will be doing, if you'll get access to that training, it's really helpful in terms of building an intuition. So, what I'll say is this that's helpful for this specific audience is that formatting, like localized formatting, like the top bars that we see in like InDesign specifically, we want to avoid using them because it doesn't carry over the semantics, and that's what we're going to deep dive into. And that's something that carries over from authoring accessible documents like in Microsoft or in PowerPoint, is that we need to use the styles panel to make sure that what we are assigning visually gets assigned something appropriately semantically so a screen reader can detect and consume it. That's the biggest core element that carries over from that other training. And if any other questions come up, I'm more than happy to answer them. So with this quick reference for InDesign, these are the things that we're looking out for, that we're kind of assessing in our mise en place of design flow, right? When we're setting up our parts of like, how are we going to build out this content in a way that ensures its accessibility once we move over to Acrobat Pro. So the Acrobat Pro version is the one that has all the accessibility tools. I could go on in another talk about the frictions around that and its arguments about accessibility, but I will say if you get access to Acrobat Pro, there are very helpful tools that help us save time and assess accessibility quite quickly between two digital ecosystems, InDesign and Acrobat. So this is an overview and a quick reference of that, and this is everything we're going to be reviewing today. So with that, we're going to start off with paragraph styles for headings specifically. So this is a way of building an intuition of how to keep document semantics and structure separate from visual appearance. So what we're doing is we're building up a muscle of understanding how something appears and how something is detected by someone who doesn't have access to vision. So that might take some time, but we'll get into the ropes of it. So first, what we're going to start with is working backwards. I find this very helpful of what does it look like to have the final output and it pepper me with issues. What does this mean? Because I'm going to show you how to eliminate these from being detected and what to do when they pop up. So with this first example, Mark was kind enough to share this InDesign file as well as PDF. So I'm going to toggle over to Acrobat Pro. And what you can see here is I have this accessibility checker. So what's great with the Pro options is that there's this tool, Prepare for Accessibility, that gives you a collection of things to evaluate. So the first thing that I look at is the accessibility checker just to see what came up. I made very minimal changes to this document. So this is just what Mark had shared with me. And I'm going to use this as an example because it's a great way to like really root into something that you're already familiar with. So something like right off the bat, what we see are these document issues. A lot of it is about reading order, not having a title and bookmarks and all this. But what does that mean? So I'm going to dive into this. What we're looking at specifically is to map our headings to heading tabs. So in other words, we're thinking about from a design lens what a certain style is and how it's tagged for semantics to show up in a PDF in a logical tagging structure. So the way that we would do this, specifically in InDesign, is taking a look at the paragraph styles. So if you don't already have it set up, you would want to go to type paragraph styles, and you can see here everything in this document, right? So this makes sense to your design team, or if you have, like, I know you're working with partners outside of Travel Oregon, I'm sure there's at least a language that you get used to in terms of how things are styled and structured. So when we are talking about mapping headings to heading tags, we're just making sure that these styles have the appropriate tags to them. So what I can do is I can select this, and it brings up the paragraph styles dialog. And if we go to export tagging, this is where we can change the style name. So in some cases, design teams change it just to have it reflect the semantics. If that works for your team, great. Sometimes people find that is confusing, and so they will keep it the language that they like to use as a design team, but also have the tag next to it. So however you name it, make sure that it just makes sense to your team and that it is clear what style is being attached to which tag. So that's just for the style name. But in this context, we want to make sure that our export tagging is selected to represent the right heading tag. So if our main heading tag is indeed an H1, we want to make sure that under EPUB and HTML, it's H1, just as a good muscle, as well as the PDF. I like checking both of these because if for some reason something needs to be mapped reflowable, I know I've already tagged my document in a way that at least those tags will port over if I have to not have a fixed PDF and instead have a reflowable EPUB document. So it's just a good practice. But this is where we would change those style options. And so if you decide to change it, you can see here that it changes it for you and it identifies it as H1. So then when you export, all of those tags that have that style will show up in Acrobat Pro, which is one of the reasons why we might see things like tagged PDF. Sometimes it says failed. I did some experimentation with this document, but if it has that, then it's a way of understanding like, oh, I didn't map my tags and my headings. So this is the easiest way to do that for consistency across InDesign and Adobe Acrobat Pro. I don't know why I keep saying Adobe before it's all Adobe. Does that make
Mike has
sense?
a question. Oh, sorry.
Sure.
Perfect timing. You task.
Yeah.
real quick. This is great. Thank you so much. And that all makes sense. And then once we have those, if we set up the style, say, we set one up for this publication, the Spur that we do all the time, and then you could theoretically save that out as a set of styles, right? And then import it into other documents, and all that would carry through. Is that
Yes.
correct? Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, great. That's great.
It is, and that's something also to consider in templates as well. That makes it easier, especially, as you're working across different regions or different teams or different clients in your context. It's
Mhm.
very helpful.
Thank you.
Of course. Were there any other questions before I move on? Okie dokie. All right. So with paragraph styles, we got a sense of mapping our style structure to tags because we know that tagging is a big foundation of PDF accessibility. That's what screen readers detect to read and understand its reading order or begin to. So now when we think about text frames, you're already doing this as a practice, and that is threading your frames for continuous content. So in all of the InDesign files, I could see that this is something that's already happening in your collaboration. In fact, yeah, when I reviewed, let's see if it goes to InDesign. So I can see that these are threaded. And this is already a good design layout practice, right? For continuous reading. It is just to add to a layer to that. It reinforces accessibility. If ever you've experimented by pulling up a PDF and using a screen reader, and then it looks like it's chunked in different ways. Like it stops reading in the middle of a paragraph, and then you tab, and then it continues reading again. Usually it means either it wasn't tagged at all or correctly, or it wasn't a text thread, or it wasn't a text frame that was threaded for continuous reading. So there's really nothing I would say to change here other than continue doing this. This is a good accessibility practice. But I think the other layer that I would add is it's contributing to this muscle that you're developing, right? You've gotten so used to, especially in editorial layout, of how things are digested visually, laid out, negative space, breathing room, flow of content, all of with the processing power of sight. And now you're adding a layer of how do people detect and consume this information if they don't have access to vision. So it's just another thing to think about in terms of how the content is consumed and what is the meaning of the flow when we think about visuals that are read out to us instead of being seen. And we'll talk about that here in a second. So continue doing threading of text frames. That's a great practice. When we're thinking about image handling, specifically alt text, there are so many things to consider. And I think as a design team, it's really important to talk about how you're determining what's a decorative image, or within InDesign, it's referred to as artifact versus a meaningful image. So I have some examples. So again, starting from that accessibility checker, I'll go over here. When we look at this section under alternate text, also known as alt text, we can see things here. What's nice about this feature as well is if I right click on it, I can choose to fix it, skip the rule, or have it explain it to me. And what's nice about the explain is that it actually, I'll just do it now, it pops up and takes you directly to the highlighted link so you can learn. I like this feature because, to my earlier point, these things are evolving and changing. And sometimes it's just really nice to be pointed in the right direction, to be like, oh yeah, that thing that used to be over here is now over here. So it's just really helpful to use that specific tool. So with image handling, there's a few scenarios. And we covered some of those scenarios in the authoring accessible documents training. I'd highly recommend checking that out. Also in these slides, I included some of those examples as a reference. It's always nice, again, to see references. So one option to think about are decorative images. And what we mean by that from an accessibility lens are images that don't necessarily contribute to the meaning of the content. So again, it's flexing this muscle of what is the flow of this information if a description of this image is being read out. So in this particular example that I have with the file that Mark sent over, I'm in no way saying that this image ought to be decorative. In fact, I could look at every image in this document and know precisely what relevance it has to the content. I'm using this only as an example of like, if you chose this to be a decorative image, this is how you would tag that. So in InDesign, what we have is this option. Let's see. Let's just say hypothetically, we felt that the flow of information that this image would be decorative. We don't necessarily want it read out. The way that we would do that, I wish you could just right click it on other options, but there's a different pathway and it's going through object and object export options. So we would go to object export options, and it gives us a few things. We can put in custom alt text where you just write it out, copy and paste it from like a reference or a resource document that might have all the alt text itemized for you. You could use the generator to the point that was made earlier. It's kind of a hit or miss with that one, so I would definitely recommend having a protocol for alt text. But in this case, if it's decorative, it means that we don't want it to be read out. So we have to make sure that we mark it as decorative. And this is the easiest way to do that. And when we use these object export options to indicate that that's a decorative image, that gets translated on the Adobe Acrobat side. So that it's not like read out unintentionally. And there are also features that we're going to talk about later on of how to search a PDF document to see if there's any unintended like decorative images in there, and then you can fix it on the fly. So this is how we would tag something as decorative. Now, let's say there's actually images that are meaningful. So here's a really great example that I found in this document. You know, there's this whole section about the Experience Indigenous Oregon that describes this cover. And when I read that section, I was like, okay, this is a meaningful image that speaks directly to this content. So in this case, we would say that we want alt text. And we definitely want to make sure that it has the context of what's being around it infused in it to strengthen that connection. So a way that we would do that in InDesign. So similarly, we'll find our image. It's taking its time here. All right.
I think that image is in a different pub. I think it's in the visitor guide publication.
Okay. I thought I had it here. There we go.
Oh, sorry. There you go. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I also know there's a lot of publications where you're like communicating this in different ones. I think it's because I've got Zoom, InDesign, and Acrobat Pro, and my computer is struggling. So in this case, what we have is this image that we've deemed is meaningful. So if we want to create alt text for it, we go to Object Export Options, and I've written something out already. And so for this, I just added alt text. It's brief. I think I left it less than 150 or close to that as a characters reminder. But also capturing like the significance of it. So if it's read out by a screen reader, it enriches what is being shared through the text itself, right? The idea is if we're going to have this image accessible to people with vision, we want to create a somewhat similar experience as much as we can that would allow them to understand the significance of that image. So in this case, this is how we would add that alt text. But some scenarios are not as simple as photos, for example. And we'll talk about that in a moment with more complex imagery. Another thing to think about in terms of content flow is anchoring images. Now, you know, when you're in your design flow and sometimes you're getting your assets, like not necessarily at the same time that you're laying things out, you want to make sure that in the final expression within your InDesign layout, that the images are anchored to the content it's intended to be with, so that when it's read out by assistive technology, like a screen reader, it makes sense. Because sometimes when we're layering in our visual assets and we don't adjust what they are assigned to in terms of content, the reading order can get a little messed up. It can get a little out of order because it's now reflecting how the images within the file are stacked rather than the intended order that you want it to be consumed. And we'll crack into that in different layers in a moment. But to simplify, we want to make sure that we anchor images within the content flow, that we know exactly when that description will be read out and that it makes sense in the context of the layout that we're putting together. So those are the foundations of image handling, how to mark it decorative so it's not read by a screen reader, and how to add meaningful alt text if you want it to be detectable by a screen reader, and anchoring it within the content flow that makes logical reading order sense. I'll pause here before we move on to tables. Are there any questions about this?
If no one else does, I have one real quick. Go back to our other training when we talked briefly about um, using alt text to kind of bridge the gap between decorative and meaningful, and using alt text to maybe talk about the inspiration of a photo rather than. And I don't remember you said something really eloquent and pointed at the time, and I forgot what you said. So if you have guidance on that, could you reshare it? Because I forgot what it was, but it was meaningful to me.
Yeah, I'm well probably be able to say it verbatim, but the heart of it is with me, and I think it'll be easier to talk about if I have a file in front of me. So yeah, so Mark asked this really great question in the training that we've been referring to of authoring accessible documents. And it's about like, hey, we have an intention around the images that we're using, which is fantastic. And so when we're thinking about whether or not to use alt text to have it readable, think about how people are consuming the information in the context, right? If I'm reading about the tribal guide here, there's a lot that's being said that when we can hear the image that's associated with it, it sets the tone, right? It can be, I know I'm not doing the answer justice, Mark, but I think it's a way of there's this other dimension of your design that people get to experience. It's another layer of brand expression and tone that we don't typically get to engage with as designers focused on a visual medium. And now we're cracking that open. And so there's opportunities to be creative with how these images are read out in the flow of this text. And if we are just hyper focused on compliance, what we're just thinking about is like, oh, we can just describe what's there. But when we think about it from a design and experience design perspective, we're really inviting them to be engaged in the culture and tone that wraps all this content together. And so it invites us to be creative about how those images are shared, how it can add dimension to this document that you're putting together that is helping people make informed decisions, but it's also denoting like a culture that's infused throughout um, these pages. So maybe it was along those lines, Mark.
Yeah,
um,
I think that's great. I think it was basically using alt text to what exactly we said, describe the brand and the mood and the tone of it. Of like, I think the example we had before was, kind of a tonal image. It wasn't directly related to the content, but it was like a view of cliffs on the coast, and talking about maybe using alt text instead of saying, it either has to be alt text or it has to be decorative and not read out, that maybe we use alt text as like an inspirational photo looking at a sunset over the Oregon coast or something to that effect, and bridging that gap so we do convey that brand intention with the visuals, I guess. So
yeah.
not a binary, but more of like, how do we use those to create to denote experiential, I guess, for lack of a better word, photography.
Yeah, that's really well said. You're inviting people into the experience of it. And I think that when it invites you as a design team and partners and collaborators to think about like when we put these pages in there, these like inspirational pages, or just like these images that denote place, like even in the beginning, right? In the table of contents, we're looking at the Port of Portland and a way of like that denotes to me wayfinding, right? And when we look at this Oregon Convention Center image, these are adding like context. But we can use these images to bring the experience alive a little more. The tricky part is thinking about like, will this really support the content that I have here, or will this operate more of as a speed bump for someone who's listening to this? And that's an intuition that you just build as a design team. And in fact, with enough scenarios and use cases, we can put together like a user testing scenario to test out like what really is helpful to our brand here versus harmful. So I feel like we could have a whole session talking about that, which is really cool to expand in that way. That being said, what Mark is encouraging us to do is be creative about what we're doing with alt text and these longer descriptions and describing the graphics that support the written content. We're going to actually revisit that with complex images, but before we do that, I'm going to move into tables if we all feel comfortable with that. So tables in InDesign and Acrobat, that's funny. It's really approaching accessibility from InDesign and Acrobat. Like, what can we do in each? With tables, I'm going to be honest with you, it is quite constrained in InDesign. There's very limited things that we can do. A lot of it is done in Acrobat Pro. So one example here, again, coming back to that accessibility checker in the beginning, this is the section that we see these things. Rows fail, there's no table header or table data that's been tagged, all of that. To be expected, right? We didn't tag this or anything, but these are the common things that we see. And I'm going to walk you through how we can reduce that. Now, with InDesign specifically, as I mentioned, it's quite limited. I will show you how to create a table, but we're going to talk about this in more realistic terms, right? Because in this particular document, the tables that I had found were not tables built in InDesign. They were screenshots of tables from somewhere else. That's okay. It makes sense. But here's something you have to think about as a design team when we do this. So if we're going to use a screenshot of a table, we have to understand what's being communicated in that table, and will it be covered in alt text, or do we have to create a longer description to make sure that it's characterized correctly? So when it comes to data in particular, you really want to make sure that that is clear. So this is what I meant earlier about having these handoff conversations with the content authors, because is that responsibility on the design team, or is that responsibility on the content author to develop that if you're not going to build out the table? Now, let's say you decide to build out that table in InDesign. What you have to do then is you still provide alt text, which is a brief description of what it is, but you don't have to write a long description describing the trends of that table, because now you are making it accessible. You're building the table in InDesign and then porting it over to Acrobat Pro to tag it appropriately. And I'm going to show you how to do that. So with let's start with creating a table. It's pretty straightforward, but again, it's because it's quite limited in InDesign. So what we have is the option to go to table and to create a table. This is kind of similar to Microsoft Word and PowerPoint, where you can create rows and columns and you can determine a header row. But if you are working with tables that are more complex than that, which with all the documentation I've seen from Travel Oregon, you are, this might not be very helpful, but it's a good start so it can at least be tagged as a table. And then what happens is once it's in Acrobat Pro, we have to make sure that it actually gets read as a table. So what I did is I recreated that example from this document. So this here was a screenshot of a table, and I just recreated it into a simple PDF so we can just focus on this. And in this case, what we can do is tag it. Now, you may be thinking, oh, Jen, this looks tedious. And you are right. It is, it is tedious, and that's why it's an important conversation to have as a team of like, do we want a screenshot of this or do we want to build it out? So I'm going to show you some straightforward ways to do this. The best way that I have found is to use the prepare for accessibility tools. So in Acrobat Pro, I've got this table here. I'm going to go to fix reading order. And oh, here we go. It's going to give me this dialog. And what it does is it provides you instructions on how to use it. So it wants us to draw a table, or sorry, it wants us to draw an outline. Oh, hello. Of the table that we want to create. So let's say we want to work on this second table. So we create a section, and that's how it's going to show up in the tags here in a moment. We select table because that's how we want it to be tagged. And then we can ask to show the order panel, which it is struggling with right now. I prepared for this in case it lagged. So what happens is once we can see the order panel and the tags, we're able to see if it is structured appropriately. So right here, it will show us that it's a table. It will show us what the table row is and what the table header is once we expand that. So let's see if it's going to let me. Here we go. So okay, let me put you over here. One good way to test this out is to tab through it, and you can see where it says TH. This is table header. It's lagging right now. But what we can do when it is behaving is every time we select this, it shows us over here with these focus indicators where it's located. So what we're looking at from a design perspective is it in logical sense? If it's in the header row, is it being read from left to right? And when I tab through it, is it jumping around or is it in line? What's nice about this accessibility tags is that if it is misaligned, you can move these tags so that the tab order is correct and in a logical order. So that is currently the best way to tag tables within Acrobat Pro so that in your final PDF, it will be read by a screen reader. Hopefully this will come back to me so we can use it. But until then, I'm going to pause here and ask if you have any questions on how to tag tables in Acrobat Pro or any issues that you may have experienced.
No, this is great. So much of it is very web-like. I'm a total SEO nerd for when it comes to web. So putting in alt text and descriptions and tags and all the H tags and everything. This is even on another geekier level. So I'm really digging it. This is going to be fun.
I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah, it's actually quite impressive what Acrobat Pro allows us to do. And it's really, of course, tugging at all the HTML language so that it is easier to consume in a logical and predictable way.
Jen, I have a quick question. Just on the reading order, what is the best reading order? Would you want it to read left to right over the header and then down the first column and then get into data, or?
Yes. So best practice would be, so it's going to be technical and maybe obvious, but making sure it aligns with your language, right? A lot of the things that we're designing are designed in the English language. So when we think about predictable reading patterns, we think left to right, top to bottom. In terms of a table, we want to think about how we expect people to consume that information. So if you are tagging it correctly, where there's a header row and a header column, we would expect that if they're going to tab through that table, that they would be able to easily understand what information is under each. So in terms of reading order, I would say making sure that it follows the protocol of left to right, top to bottom. So in this table, I would expect to be able to start from the top, tabbing through the row, the header row, then going down to the next row, and then going across like column to column from left to right. That way it's predictable in nature because you may not understand how that person wants to consume that information or like what they're trying to extract. So following a predictable left to right, top to down reading order makes the most sense. You feel like that answers the question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions for this section?
Maybe this is something you're going to get into later, but
Yeah.
how is this adapted for like pie charts or line graphs?
Yeah, so that is, let's take a look at InDesign. So if you are deciding, for example, here, let's say you want to tag this, and it's not necessarily a table, but what you can do is tag how it's read. So if you feel, and this is where like you might have to have a conversation with the content author. When we're looking at this pie chart, where are we starting and where are we ending? Because then in the tag panel, you can determine that order in which it will be consumed. And I will show you another flow pattern too. So in this case, unless you have it attached to a data table that you want the reader to consume, you are now just tagging this as an information graphic or an interactive PDF that they can tab through. So with that scenario, you would have a longer description of what that is. And we're going to talk about long descriptions here in a second. And then making sure that the tab order around the pie chart represents the intended communication of the data that's being presented. Is that helpful?
Yes, that makes sense.
Are there any other questions about this? Alrighty. So let's talk about then data visualizations and charts, right? This is a great segue into it because there's different interactions that we have to account for if it's going to be expressed in a fixed PDF format. So a recap on a couple of things. What's the difference between alt text and long description? So in alt text, like what we've been talking about, it's shorter. Typically, it's 150 characters or less. It's intended to be brief. So don't try to like hyper focus of like, oh, I must get it into 150. It's just meant to be a brief description of the image that's being detected. But when we get to more complex images, like what we were talking about with the pie chart, and I have an example of an illustrated map with a legend, then we need extended longer descriptions so that they're characterized appropriately because there's only so much a brief description in alt text can really cover. So we're going to talk about different scenarios when this comes up. So for example, there's one image that has a lot going on that's really great. So I get a lot of questions about images like this, which is an illustrated map. Let's go to InDesign and take a look at this the culinary pages. Okay, this really cool illustrated map that's got a legend. It's got stuff speckled all over it. And as a designer, thinking about like, how do I make this accessible? There's a variety of ways to do this, and it depends on how you want people to interact with it. So in this case, let's say we want to start with the alt text. So like if it's going to be detectable on a website or in this PDF, we know that once it's detected as an image, it will read out this alt text. It's brief. It gives you a quick overview of what's being contained here. You can actually probably make it even more brief than what I put here, but because there's an illustrated element and it's beautiful, I feel like you gotta put some of that in there so that it is consumable. But it is kind of like an infographic. So you want to consider a long description. Now, for a long description, I took a stab at it and I wrote it out. That's a lot of text, right? That's just text. And this first section is the description of it. And then the second section is the legend of reading it out, right? So if we have that. Now, that is just if you wanted a long description of that, if you're not necessarily intending on it being interactive, then what do you do with a long description like this in this scenario? There's a few things. We can put it in a footnote or endnote in the document, and InDesign, as you're probably aware, has this as an option. What's nice about it is that it keeps you within the document, but makes you jump around. So just make sure that if you add it as an endnote, that it is easy to get back to where they were reading before. So it's not too disorienting. Another option that is available, but realistically less ideal, is to link to an external resource. Now, with some complex imagery, especially with very dense data dashboards or data visualizations and more like numbers focused reports, this might be the best option. Again, you want to think about how people are consuming this information realistically. So in this option, if you link to an external resource, it's helpful because you have a descriptor available that allows the reader to dive deeper into the information with their assistive technology. However, it comes at the cost of taking them out of the document or whatever instance they're in. So we have to be mindful of the experience of how many tabs are we having this user navigate, because navigating tabs with assistive technology is not as easy as navigating tabs with someone who has access to vision and is using a mouse. So these are options to think creatively about how you can make sure that that longer information is available and detected, with understanding some of the constraints and limitations and risks that come with it. So in this visual, another option here is if you decide to make it interactive, right? If I have this as an accessible PDF, and let's say you decide that it is meaningful to be able to tab through each one of these numbers using a tab through, then you're kind of treating it like it's not a table, but you're tagging it in a sequential order to make sense if someone is tabbing through with a keyboard. So we would, again, go back to Acrobat, and we could open up the reading order and then just manually tag everything so that when it's tabbed through, it makes logical sense. And that way, those tags exist. The option to tab through it is there. And then you're not having to spend so much time with all these alts of making sure to include a longer description, because you're making it interactive. You're inviting them into the graphic. So again, that's a conversation to have as a design team. Is it coming back? We'll see, it's still thinking. So with that, as a recap, remember that alt text is short and brief. Once it's detected as an image, that's what's read out. Long text, longer image descriptions are something that we can use for more complex imagery. It begs us to be creative about how we integrate that imagery. If you can't insert it into the text itself somewhere, or if there's like not a place for an image description, you may want to think about inserting it as a footnote or endnote or as an external resource. But just always consider what the overall experience is like for the intended user. Are they more going to be diving into the numbers, or they just need to know that this asset exists? These are the kinds of conversations that are helpful during handoff as well.
I have a quick question about the linking out option.
Yeah.
Someone asked me about that yesterday as in a PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm.
If they put a link, it was like screenshots of social media, and So we were talking about linking out to the social media post. If they put a link in an alt tag, I wasn't sure if, because I know that you can go to the next link and with screen readers, you can go to the next button, but I wasn't sure. I know it would like probably read out the link, but would it actually be accessible? Like, would they be able to get to that? Or should it be something like on the screen itself?
So are you saying that there's a link in the alt text?
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's a if you do put in a link in an alt text, if someone can actually use that link.
So in my experience, it would not.
Okay.
I think what it would do is it would show the URL,
Yeah.
but it wouldn't allow you to go, it wouldn't actually be a clickable link.
Okay. That's what we kind of went with, but
Yeah,
thank you. That's
of
helpful.
course. Yeah, that's how it is currently. If that changes, I mean, it could. But so far, I don't think that it behaves like that because then it would require more nested tagging, and that makes things complicated from a code perspective.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
I have another quick question.
Yeah.
In the example where you're making the changes in Acrobat Pro, like for the
Mhm.
chart, you're adding the alt tags. Let's just say, for instance, somebody catches a typo on that page and you have to remake that PDF.
Yeah.
Is there a way to import all that work you had done on the chart into the new PDF, or do you have to start over?
So you can, if you have Acrobat Pro, you can edit that table as a PDF. What gets tricky sometimes, in my experience, is depending on how your fonts are set up, you might lose some styling. So that is usually the biggest issue that I've seen is if you make an edit, but then the style doesn't match because of how things are connected with your Creative Cloud and your typography, then that poses an issue. But generally, you should be able to edit the content directly into the PDF. It's just something that you would have to note that it's not going to necessarily match your source documentation. So if that's not a problem, you can edit it in Acrobat Pro and not have to start over.
Great. Thank you.
Yes, of course.
Real quick question to that point. I know that like buttons you can copy and paste from PDF to PDF. So like is in this example right here, is that chart number one box that you have on the top table in the background,
Mm-hmm.
is that selectable as an item that, to Nikki's point, if you needed to, not just edit a number, but edit a content in like the row or column, um, like the first column, could you do that, output a PDF and then paste this in to like, is it how I guess I could try this later, but is that number one box right there selectable and copy and pastable from PDF to PDF if you have the same page and everything?
In practice, I do not think that you can copy and paste it like that from PDF to PDF.
Okay.
But I will also say that the updates within the accessibility features are continuous. So at this point in time, I do not believe you can copy and paste it. I've tried it before and it was not successful, but it may be something that could be accessible in the future.
Okay.
Yeah, because there's just so much tagging and everything that would be ported over, and it would be nice if we could do that, but currently it lags a bit in that department.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think that's a great question. And then speaking of some lagging, I might have to restart my Acrobat because it's not responding. So, um, I'm going to let that quit so I can reopen it. But we're going to move on to other sections. I counted that this might have a little bit of a lag because of having InDesign and Acrobat and PowerPoint and Zoom open all at the same time. So we're going to revisit that. But let's talk about exporting tagged accessible PDFs in Acrobat. So some exporting habits that are really helpful. When we're thinking about from InDesign specifically, there are two main things that we want to do, and that's to check our metadata and to export as a PDF. So this is something that is a carryover from the previous training of authoring accessible documents. The biggest takeaway from that is with accessibility in mind, we don't want to print to save as a PDF because what it does is it flattens your entire document and strips away the semantics. So it's really important across all these different authoring tools to make sure you're saving as a PDF. So when we do that in the export dialog, we also want to make sure that we're selecting two important things, and that's creating a tagged PDF and using the structure for tab order. So the way that generally looks is when we're in our, we drop down our file, we can go directly into the file info and type the document title. So in InDesign, for example, I can go, let's see, down to file info, and I can see where the document title is and the author. So depending on how you like to tag the metadata of your documents, especially if you're collaborating in and outside of the organization, this is where you want to make sure that your semantics are consistent. So for a document title, you can write in exactly what you want that title to be. This is, I know it seems simple, but it's so important because that is what's read out to the screen reader. And sometimes what gets inherited when this is not intentionally added is it just pulls metadata, and it's usually the name of the file. And with filing, file nomenclature, sometimes you don't necessarily want it to read out OTC underscore strat plan progress report underscore March dash 2026 underscore final. You want it to read strategic planning progress report for March 2026. So you get to think about how you want that read out. It's important to do this in InDesign because this is what gets ported over into Acrobat Pro. And right now, as silly as it seems, it's best to do it in InDesign because it makes it really hard to change it once it's a PDF in Acrobat. So this is what we want to make sure that we do before we export it into a PDF. And then, of course, file, save as, or export as an interactive PDF. Actually, I did save as. Export. So we want to make sure that we're selecting Adobe PDF Interactive, which means that it's going to preserve all the semantics that you have added in your mapping tree in InDesign, so it ports over to Acrobat. If you did it as print, again, it flattens the file and it strips it away, so then it's not going to be a tagged document, and then you may have to do it manually, which is really time consuming. So doing this saves you a lot of time just from the exporting itself. So that's what we do and check for in InDesign before we make our way into Acrobat Pro. So I showed you how to change the metadata, and you can add other things in there if that is what you require as your organization. You also have the ability to export as an interactive PDF that preserves all your tags, which makes it very helpful. And in that dialog box, we want to make sure that we're selecting create a tagged PDF and use structure for tab order. Having those will show up in the Acrobat Pro, which makes things really easy to just refine at the end. So for verifying accessibility in Acrobat, there's some easy checks here. I wouldn't say easy checks. I would say that there are tools that are available that make checks easier. So specifically, what we like to look at the end when we're ready to publish is checking that the document title ported over from InDesign, that we set the initial view to document title. That part is important because it is reading out the document title to the person who's using the assistive technology. We want to specify the language. I know that seems simple, but it's really important because at this point, screen readers cannot detect language. It must be told what the language is in order for it to have the right pronunciation rules assigned to it and know that the reading order is logical for that language. So again, in English, it's top to bottom, left to right. Not all languages operate that way. So when we are able to specify that language, and let's say someone on the other side might be using translation tools, it also makes it easier for it to detect what the original language is so that it can translate it to the language it's intended for. So this simple dialogue check makes a big difference for accessibility. We also want to check the tag structure, the reading order, and the tab order. And I'm going to show you what those features look like within Acrobat Pro. So the first thing we want to do is check the document properties. So under the file section, we can go to document properties and get the dialog box that allows us to see the title. So in this case, let's see. I was just seeing if it was going to come back. It may not, so I'm going to rely on these screenshots for now. But in this case, what we can see is that it preserved the file name, but it did port over the title that we wrote in. So Strategic Plan Progress Report, March 2026. However you want it read out to the assistive tech. So this is important to check to make sure that it's not just rattling off the file name. In addition to that, we want to, in the same document properties dialog, we just go to initial view and make sure that we are showing the document title. So it just ensures what we have here. We have this document title. And then as the initial view, we are confirming that it's not reading out the file name, that it's reading out the document title name. And then we can head over to advanced in the same property box and make sure that English is selected. Usually that's there as a default after you do this for a few rounds, but it's always good to double check because sometimes things get shifted. So all of that can be done within that document properties dialog. So after that is all checked, then we get into more of the nitty gritty of it. So we want to double check our tags. So if you don't already have, let's see if it will let me show here. So, okay. On the sidebar here to the far right, you can see that I have this tags icon, this reading order icon, and this thumbnail icon. All of these I have put there because this is a common workflow that I use. But if you haven't done that yet, you can find them through the menu items by going to View, Show, Hide, Side Panels, and then you can orient what you need from your side panels. And there's a lot of accessibility smart tabs here that you can just add there, like again, setting up your mise en place. And this allows you to see your tags, which is fantastic. And that's something that we can see here. All of these are accessibility tags that allow us to see what the tab structure is, to double check that it makes sense based on everything that we've laid out in InDesign. The next thing we want to do is to get a good sense of the reading order. So I wish my Acrobat wasn't frozen right now so I can show you a little bit more interactively, but I'll do my best because it is captured here on this screen. So again, in that same view, you can show the side panel of the reading order. And what it does is so helpful for those who have access to vision is it maps out. You can see these little numbers here. it does that for the entire document, right? And you can see in the order panel what the arrangement is. Now, there's some of this that's a little misleading, right? Because it has these numbers here, but the numbers in the orders panel do not determine the reading order. That's just how the images are stacked, which is why you see the numbers start over for every page. That's just how the visuals are layered within the document. Reading order you want to pay attention to are the numbers that are next to everything that's tagged. And that reading order is how things are read out by a screen reader. And what's nice about having this visual is that you're able to quickly see if something is out of alignment. What's really helpful about this, and actually I can show an example because I have access to InDesign. One example I had queued up here is for, let's see, there are images of people in kind of like a tree, an organizational tree. I think it's further up. Here, okay. So when I exported this as a PDF and I could see the reading order, you would, let's say, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. However, that's not how the reading order appears on the Acrobat panel. It shows the numbers jumping around a bit. And so as a designer, we can quickly look at that and be like, oh, this is actually pulling from different data to determine what that is. I'm going to rearrange it so it actually reads in the order that it was intended. And that's what Acrobat Pro allows you to do. And with these numbers, it allows you to configure and move things around in a way that reflects the intention of the content flow. So it's really helpful to use, the order pane and the tags pane. So you can see how things are actually structured and how assistive technology is going to read out your document. The other thing you want to check is the tab order. So again, in a similar way, you can go to your view menu and show the pages panel. And what it shows are thumbnails of the images of the document. You want to select them all and then use this option to pull up the page properties so that you can use the document structure to determine the tab order. So if you've structured everything like what we talked about in InDesign, it's going to adopt that, and then you can easily check the tab order to make sure that it's in a sequential order that makes sense. And then finally, under accessibility tags, it's important that we check for unmarked content. Sometimes things get in there, like we're laying things out and there are invisible elements. I have found this a lot when I do reviews for accessibility with PDFs, that when I'm using a screen reader and doing a manual evaluation, hidden elements come up. So you can't see them. They're not visible to people who are consuming the information with sight, but screen readers can detect them. So what's nice about that, this specific feature is under tags. If you select this options button, you'll be able to select find. There's a drop down where you can just search the entire document or a page for unmarked content. And then it will show you within the panel so that you can go through and determine whether it needs to be tagged or just deleted. So you can easily just kind of prune the structure of your document to make sure that nothing was missed. So as a quick overview, what we can do with Acrobat Pro once we've exported it with those considerations in mind for tagging, for accessibility, is it makes the check in the tools for Acrobat Pro much easier. So then it's just like a flow of information, checking my reading order, the tab makes sense, making sure that the tags are tagging appropriately, that a table is a table and a list is a list and a paragraph is a paragraph. You can quickly detect where some of the biggest issues might come up. and resolve most of them in Acrobat Pro. Sometimes if things seem a little wonky, it usually means you have to change something in InDesign. But with what we've covered, if you've done those things, you will rarely see that. So I'm going to pause here to see if you have any questions before we talk about accessibility templates.
I have a quick question. How do, I guess, a couple things, like your example of the commissioner reading order, does it establish that reading order by which ones you place in which sequence in InDesign? Like this picture was placed first, this one was placed second, and then you switch them, it still does by which one was placed first and second?
Yeah, so what it does is it inherits the document structure.
Mhm.
So it's sometimes, this is where it gets a little murky. So this is a great question. We, with the way that it defaults is sometimes it's pulling the order based on how the images were added to the file. And we have to sometimes rearrange that. So if you change something in tags, you're okay. It's not going to affect the reading order. When you change the reading order, it will affect other things in the document like tags, because then it's determining like when it's actually being read out. So to answer that question in summary, I would say that the document is pulling over the structure from InDesign. So any changes that you make sure that you're in the correct panel, whether it's reading order or tags. And if it's really you're concerned about how things are layered, go to reading order because that's going to make more sense in terms of how things are consumed and the sequence that they're consumed by a screen reader.
And then to that point too is how do layers in InDesign affect like reading order or anything like, because I know we might have like, page numbers or, just there's different layers within it. How does that play with assistive technology?
Yeah, so with that layers, the way that that shows up from the layers panel in InDesign, the most common thing that we'll see is it's these numbers here. So I wish I could zoom in more. Here we go. So I'm in this order panel, and the way that Acrobat, the PDF is translating it from InDesign is you see these numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 going on all the way to 17 for page 2 and for page 1. So the layers are translated by the PDF as how they are stacked. And um, and that is mostly the extent of that. So you could change the layer of how the image is stacked, but that's just how those visuals are stacked on each other, which is why looking at the tab order makes you understand how the entirety of that image, because like sometimes in the layers we have things grouped and it's just one image. The tab order is reading the sequence of that entire image as a package rather than how it's stacking. Here, it's just translating it as this is how this particular page has all of its images stacked there. But that's the most that it's pulling from those layers.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. What's interesting about tab order and reading order is it forces us to flex between the macro and the micro, right? We understand how images are built in InDesign, but we have to understand how they're packaged in this semantic language so that your visual intention is matching up with the chronology of assistive tech, which is why I'm trying to craft my words carefully.
So my team sends a lot of PDFs as email attachments, like often hundreds. And historically, if they've been, more than a page or two long, I've compressed the file to sort of minimize us running out of Outlook storage
Yeah.
overnight. Does that flatten away all of the accessibility tagging?
It should not.
Okay.
It should not do that. That's a great question. No, if everything is tagged appropriately and you have it zipped, it should not strip that away unless you saved it for print or you print to PDF and then zipped it. But generally, my experience is that those tags are preserved.
Okay.
I would say to that point, I've gone into the manual compression, and there are presets, I think, too, but there are aspects in Acrobat where you can go in and toss out all kinds of stuff, whether it's alt text or tags or any of those things, and compress images to certain DPIs and everything. So I would test it before you put it in your workflow, just because I don't know if some of those presets are throwing away tags, they won't come through. So I don't know
Yeah.
how much what your compression is actually doing. If it's just compressing images or it's tossing out all kinds of data. So
Sure.
I would say test it.
Yeah. Thanks.
Fully support that. Definitely. When in doubt, test. Any other questions before we start talking about templates? All right. All right. So much of this is probably going to be redundant for you, but I want to make sure that we touch it from an accessibility lens. When we're talking about templates and fixing issues at the source, there are a few things that can be really helpful. And some of them we've discussed through our questions throughout this training. But some things around template essentials and is making it easier to identify the reading order, especially if we bake it into primary pages or those paragraph styles. If we have files that already have that set up and it's part of onboarding with collaborators, of like, this is how we set this up, and the reason why we set it up this way is to support accessibility, that's really helpful. I've also seen it be quite effective to have like placeholder frames with alt text reminders or instructions for image handlers. Um, Even document setup checklists, you can embed them in the templates, or I've also seen this expressed in handoff notes, especially if you're a design team that's working with a variety of content authors. So having something where you're able to capture information. That example that we used earlier, hey, if we're going to use this screenshot of a table, we just need to know like what we want to make sure is characterized and that it's characterized accurately if we're going to have to describe it. So that's something that can be really effective in a handoff scenario working with other teams that can be packaged with your templates. We talked a little bit about reusable assets, so a library of pre-tagged accessible graphic components. Having some kind of call out like, hey, there's a certain structure and ethos that we use around these reusable assets. Color palettes, I know that Travel Oregon has an established brand style guide. And so making sure that it's built in from there in terms of like contrast checks and having some kind of process in place too. I know we talked about this a little bit in the authoring accessible documents, but if someone is using Travel Oregon's branded templates and they come across a use case for like, hey, I'm following the brand style guides, but it's not passing this contrast check for some reason, they might flag it for the design team to like, hey, this is what I did in the short run, but what do we want to do to make sure that we're preserving our brand in these certain scenarios? So having some kind of flow of when an issue arises from using template or reusable assets. Pre-built table styles that export with proper heading row tagging, that is so helpful. I have found it effective for teams that are doing a lot of rich data visuals. They have like a kit of parts, so different table examples that are already primed and tagged for different scenarios that make it helpful, so that you're not like hunting down information or in like Adobe's reference library trying to figure out how to do a certain thing. So addressing your most common like table usages and having a collection of different orientations with accessibility notes, it can be really helpful if you see yourself repeating those design patterns. And then some team habits that are helpful is really training content authors and designers. I know designers already use styles consistently, but just making sure that it's reinforced in other areas and having a note about how it helps to support accessibility and reminding people that local formatting, like InDesign, that top bar, does not translate into neat tagging. That's why we need to use these paragraph styles, and we need to use lists and table styles so that they are tagged appropriately. So these are just few things that are really helpful when we're talking about sharing templates and reusable assets that can reduce the friction and workload on the design team once you're already in your flow and build out mode. These are the top things that I would recommend. There's more to add to that, but I think if you start here, you naturally illuminate what specific things help your teams do what they need to do and make it accessible. So another thing that I think is important to tap into are platform considerations, right? As designers, we think a lot about the output of the expression of what we're putting together and communicating and characterizing. And so there are some things that we need to address with our third-party tools and services that make that easier. So some specifics, like top 5 things I would recommend is identifying tool constraints early. So for example, in the representative sample I reviewed for our trainings, a lot of these PDFs were being consumed through a third party called Issue, which provides a flipbook of a PDF. And at that time in the assessment, that flipbook was not accessible. It did have an accessibility note that stated like, hey, we're working on it. It's currently being assessed and we're working on making it accessible. But you never know how long that's going to take. And I can tell you that flipbooks are notoriously complex and challenging to make accessible. So it may take them some time. So as a design team, we have to think about, well, what's our workaround for that? Having an accessible PDF is that. If you're already creating an accessible PDF, that's great. But sometimes when you're talking to your vendors, especially vendors that are on top of it, they're communicating like, hey, this is a known constraint, we're working on it. It's also worth considering like, hey, is having an accessible PDF enough? Or would it be better to have it in an EPUB format so that it's more responsive to how this is actually being consumed? So it can just help to have that conversation with your vendors that are already like addressing this. And Issue, I think, is a great example of that. They have been responsive to my inquiries about it, and I have been bugging them about it. And that's a good sign that they're like, hey, we're figuring this out. Here's where we're at. And that is language that you can also use, from a platform's perspective, to make sure that you incorporate into your accessibility statement, like, hey, we know these constraints and this is what's being done. It's really the best that we can do. Sometimes it's really helpful to request an accessibility conformance report. Oftentimes the language that's thrown around is asking for a VPAT, which means voluntary product accessibility template. It's a terrible name. I think accessibility conformance report is more effective. It's virtually the same thing. And it's just a signal of how seriously the vendor's taking accessibility conformance. honestly, I wouldn't be such a stickler of like they must have a VPAT or an ACR of some kind. It's really, are they prepared to answer questions about accessibility and how do they communicate it? Because the most important thing about an accessibility conformance report or VPAT is that it's telling you what conformance criteria they're looking to adhere to, what current constraints exist, what are the limitations, what they're doing to fix it, and how to reach out if someone experiences a barrier. If they have those components, that is a vendor worth having a conversation with. If they don't, if they can't speak to it, if they deflect, then that's something you have to think about as a design team or from a platform's perspective of like, well, is it worth continuing this relationship if we have to adhere to these regulations and they're not prepared to support that? Other things that are really helpful from a design team perspective is having an idea of where the workflow breaks. So tracing handoff points from InDesign, PDF, Acrobat, and delivery, where does that metadata, where is it most at risk of being lost or corrupted? You know, you're working with a lot of different authors and people working on content. So identifying where it's most vulnerable will be very helpful to strengthen it in key handoff moments. As Mark had suggested earlier, it's always good to test things out. I would highly recommend getting familiar with at least one of these tools. I'd recommend starting with a tool that's already embedded in the hardware that you use, because that is the most practical scenario for people that rely on assistive tech. What's also been helpful in the past with teams is, you know, someone might be really versed in voiceover, someone else might have access to JAWS or NVDA, and just kind of setting up a system of like, hey, could I have you check this experience through NVDA? I only have voiceover, you know, really patchworking your support in a way so that not everyone has to know everything, but you have a really good reference to check things if you're not sure. And then lastly, evaluating vendor accountability. So um, as a design team, you know, there are limitations there, but it is good to ask or provide language to whoever helps you with your vendor procurement around what you need to do your workflow the best way that you can. So are these vendors and services and tools you're using actively improving accessibility support? Are they speaking to a roadmap of some sort? Will they be able to respond to any issues that you may have? This is all part of operationalizing accessibility and understanding what your team needs if you experience friction that your references can't help you out with. And it's very vendor or partner specific. So these things are really helpful to make sure that we're not overloading too much accessibility responsibility on one specific team, because it often gets thrown on the shoulders of designers and engineers and developers, right? So there are some other things that we can ask for to help support these workflows to make sure that we're not getting bogged down by hunting down for answers, but just doing the work and laying things out and making sure that they pass for accessibility and that they're indeed accessible for people. So finally, there are resources. All of these are quite helpful depending on where you are in your accessibility journey. I started it with really high level getting started, understanding the different roles across teams. You know, design, visual design is a very specific component, but there's support before and after you that's also effective to understand. Accessible PDF basics, some of this we covered in the previous training. Some of this was just foundational stuff that we've covered in our conversation here. But I also wanted to partner it with InDesign and advanced PDF accessibility. These options from DQ are really helpful. I still use them as a reference. And what's great about these ones too is now they have tools where you can like query something specific and it can hunt down the right tutorial for you. So especially if you're just figuring it out, or if you're a team that's really small and you've got a lot of responsibility, having very effective references to help you problem solve on the spot is always helpful in your design mise en place. And then of course, some options for alt text. All right, I'm going to stop there to see if there are any other questions, or if you want me to revisit anything that we've talked about. I know we've crawled across a lot of different contexts and features, so I want to make sure that it's sticking and it makes sense.
It
Yeah, thank
will.
you.
It'll stick and make sense once I get into the weeds of using it
Definitely.
regularly. That's, you know,
Yeah,
no.
you did such a fantastic job really explaining it and going through the steps and communicating it so well. I've been reading a lot of this online and I get lost in the weeds. And you did such a great job explaining it.
Thanks.
Yes.
I appreciate
A
that, Nikki.
layman's overview for us visual designers.
Go figure, making accessibility accessible. Like how dare we even do that?
Jen, I have one question. Is there a checklist, like comprehensive checklist of like, have you seen these of like just a cheat sheet of setting up the document, designing the document, outputting the document, checking it, and like I know that I've seen parts of that exist in different places, like obviously like the PDF checking checklist of, order, reading order and tags and alt text, but are there any that even if they're separate, we could piece together and have as a resource of like starting to pub?
Yeah, so there are patchworks of checklists, and I've included that in the resources. I'm actually currently building out something interactive because it's so disorienting. Even in the training of just like the checklist that I show you, it's like there's a quick checklist guide, and then there's like the in-depth stuff. And my intention is not to overwhelm. So I have yet to find something that is that comprehensive outside of DQ University. So I almost use like their courses as like a comprehensive checklist, which is a lot. I'm not going to lie. But they have like PDF overviews. And so I've included the ones that are public facing that I'm allowed to share, I've included in the resources. I'm currently building out something interactive. I think it's gonna live in Notion and I'll just make it public. It's in beta of where you can depending on what your source file is and what your export is, you can actually filter that out so you can see the checklist in context.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. Very
Yes.
cool.
I will definitely be sharing that with you once I have it going. Because transparently, there are checklists that exist that are behind paywalls that I'm not allowed to share. So it's like, hey, you can go to DQ. So whenever I can find an open-faced, like an open source one, I share it with everyone, and I've included that. But there are some contexts where it's not like that. And it's like nested in this weird way. And referring you to the quick reference guide of LogHag is also a lot. Nikki, Max, and Paul, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a good reference to know technically what needs to be done. But as a designer, it makes I want my eyes will fall out of my sockets. It's so dry, and I don't like I really have to translate it. So that's my long answer of saying, yes, there are checklists. Is there one that's comprehensive based on what you're asking for? Not yet, but I'm working on it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This has been great.
I'm glad it's helpful. Yeah, and I know too, if when you're in the weeds and things come up, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I really do. I learn when you all are learning too, because there are so many different contexts to consider that I'm happy to like dig in and really figure it out. So if questions should arise, like don't hesitate to email me, and I'd be happy to provide additional references or just like dive into a document, because sometimes that's the best way to figure it out is experimenting. I know we had extra time. I'd offered it up if anyone had a specific like issue, and we could use that as a clinic of some sort, but also we don't have to drain the time if there isn't anything in particular you wanted to explore.
I something just popped into my mind. I was like, how am I going to do this? Like,
Yeah.
we have lodging listings in the visitor guide. And for each lodging listings, they have icons that tell you, hey, this is pet friendly, this has swimming, this is, whatever it is. And they're little graphics. And there's, let's just say hundreds and hundreds of lodging listings. And practically, you're not going to be able to go in and tag each one of those. But it's really important information for a reader with sight. So something like that, I wouldn't know how to address that. Um,
Yeah. So, okay. So if you think about it, it's what you're wanting to convey with that iconography is with each listing, what like amenities it has with it. I don't know if that's how you want to describe it. So if I don't have access to vision and I want to know if those amenities exist, it may be how you code those tags. So if you're on a certain location, it could be that you can either create alt text of like an accessibility icon with alt text that just reads out the amenities for you. Um, Otherwise, you're right, it would be a little bit, it depends on how it's read out. So like if your icons are actually meaningful and you have them next to each listing, you want to think about how it concisely describes that icon so that if they tab through it, they know
right.
this listing is like pet friendly, has this, and this. If it doesn't work out like logically on paper, that makes sense. But if you're like actually testing it, you're like, no, this is actually a little more convoluted. You may want to create an accessibility icon that just includes all the amenities attached to it for a reader. Now, when we do that, we definitely want to test it out and be like, does this convolute the messaging and the information, or does it help? Um, that will help you identify like how you may want to layer that information. The other thing we have to think about too when we're thinking creatively with dense information or complex information is trying not to create such an othering experience.
Mhm.
That is really hard for information that is visually rich. So I feel like the best way to do it is to experiment and to test it out and think about the verbosity of what's being read out to you, while also being mindful that you do have access to sight. So how you hear it is going to be different than if we test it with real people who have low visual acuity or don't have access to sight using these tools. That's why having testing is really helpful with real people. But if you can't do that, just think about how if it's read out to you and it feels like a lot, that's because a lot of your like high processing is happening through sight. And people who are listening, they're listening to things wicked fast. Like so fast, they're consuming that information. So try to kind of like gauge that when you're testing it out, um, to see if it's like adding more information or if it's too othering. You'll get a good gut check once you actually test it out with a screen reader.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Jen,
Oh, oh.
if Nikki does the icon for the pet and it says pet friendly,
Mhm.
when she copies and pastes, will the alt tag copy and paste as well?
It should.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
if it's tagged appropriately, yeah, it will.
Okay. And then at the top of the document, or before the listings, it could have a list that says, you know, these amenity icons mean da 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 da.
Like a
So
legend.
like a
Mhm.
legend, yeah. So
Yeah,
like,
yeah. So with the legend, so this is a great addition. You want to make sure like sometimes the legends are like in the bottom right hand corner, right? For visual people, we quickly refer to it. But now, if you're thinking about it from a reading order perspective, you want to make sure that it's tagged to be read before any of the other information. So that's what I was talking about earlier about developing that muscle of, okay, I know how people perceive this with vision, but now that we're adding this layer of how people perceive it when it's read out, we want to make sure that legend is detected sooner since they're consuming that information top to bottom, left to right. And even if it is located over in the right-hand corner, make sure that that tab order is sooner. So like, let's say it's the second thing. There's the title of your graphic, and then the second thing is the legend. Make sure that that is reading number 2 and not like 25.
Right. But then taking it a step further, a visually impaired person wouldn't need the legend because it's going to read out, hey, this little dog icon means it's pet friendly. So they no longer need the legend. It's going to tell them, hey, this is pet friendly. It has a restaurant. They already knows what it means. So they
Yeah,
don't need the legend.
yes. But it might be helpful for orientation too, of just like, oh, it's just reading things out to me.
Right, right. This is what it means, right?
Yeah. And so sometimes, depending on how big the legend is, you could even put in there to like just skip to the listings. So they could totally bypass that. And they're like, okay, I get it. This is a legend. I'm consuming something that has a lot of amenity descriptors next to each listing. Okay, I got it.
Right.
And that logic happens really fast too. If you watch someone who does screen reader testing, like if ever you do user testing with Fable, which I highly recommend, they video record people testing out your designs and they coach you of like, hey, this is how this is perceived. And you hear it out. And it's so helpful. And even in that use case, sorry, I'm going on a whole box about this. Even in that use case, even though it's specific to like the thing you're studying, it it translates into so many other iterations. You're building up your intuition, which is why it's really nice if you have the resources to do like focus study groups to help really understand how these behave in reality versus theory.
It's great.
I love that. Jesse, we should consider doing that with like the Spur or whatever, some of our um more built out docs and have that service or that readout done. And because then we can just use that to inform not only the design of our templates and everything, but we wouldn't have to test each individual document, obviously. It'd be just we build for that and learn that, like Jen is saying, learn for that and then extrapolate. That'd be really cool.
That would be.
Yeah. And it's something I have had experience doing before for like large enterprise design systems. We we like reviewed all of the most common design patterns that were being used and identified the friction points and then created a use case testing scenario for people who rely on AT of like, we want to understand the behavior of this, and this. How does it realistically work? And when you describe it in a brief like that with user testing with people who rely on AT, they get it. And it just proves to be effective. And now it's speaking to the design system instead of just one instance. And it helps you with all of your templates and reusable assets too. It's highly effective.
Very cool.
I work with the advertisers in the travel guide, and so often I'm receiving PDF artwork from businesses and organizations that then get embedded into an Adobe InDesign file and they get re-exported as a PDF. So does that need to be treated as like a complex image? It's probably the best.
Based on that scenario, it sounds like it would be a complex image. And so this is where like having a handoff conversation is helpful of saying, hey, we have accessibility considerations. This is our approach to alt text. Like, this is just an example. Like, here's my approach to alt text and long descriptions. What is important for you? You can ask, like, do you want to provide that or do you want me to provide it? And if you want me to provide it, what is important that is characterized here? So it helps you understanding what these requirements are, helps you articulate what you need from the person who's delivering this document to you. And if they're going to entrust it to you, then you have language that says, okay, here's my approach, here's my ethos, this is how I'm going to do this. You can choose whether or not you want to have that checked by the person who sent it over, like who does the final review to make sure that it's characterized correctly. But in that instance, yes, it would be a complex image.
I love that, and we're starting to use that, with even content providers within our internal documents, like that report you've been showing. If someone supplies an image of a trade show that they've gone to, I'm asking that they supply the verbiage for that because I have no context other than that's IPW. I recognize that because of the content there, but I don't know who's in it, who's important, or any of that. So we're kind of building that into our reporting system too, that handoff conversation. And I'm trying to push it to where I don't want to generate it myself because I'll get it wrong every time on their content. But they provide that with the image. If you're going to include the image, let us know what do you want it tagged as, or how read out as.
Yeah, Mark, that's great. And it's really in alignment with destination stewardship, right? Because there's so many communities that are represented. Part of the reason why I use that example with the indigenous cover is there's a lot of representation there. So are you are demonstrating destination stewardship by asking like what is important that's characterized by this image. And I think that some people may not be able to answer it, and some people are like, I'm so glad you asked. Here's what's important. And then you're building trust in that like one layer of interaction.
Yeah, about that.
And on that note, I think you can actually put that as metadata in the image. So when you drop it into InDesign, you won't have to do anything else. It'll automatically populate it. I mean, obviously double check it.
Yeah, definitely checking for context. And I know too that you rely, I know when I used to do the RCTP layouts, like way back in the day, there's like a bank of images. And I always thought like, is it barber stock or something like that, where it had that in there, the context, the region, like it already has alt text associated with it that makes it helpful. So as a creative collaborator that's working with an internal team at Travel Oregon, it's not something you have to hunt down. It's just there. So but that process takes time because I know Travel Oregon has so many images to pull from. Well, if I know we're at time or a minute over, I'm gonna package up the PowerPoint and send it to you all. I'll send it as a PowerPoint so you can look at the reading order if you're interested. And that part too, there's some great resources in there as well. And of course, feel free to email me if you have any questions. And I'll definitely be sharing out that beta of the interactive checklists. But there are checklists that are included in the resources too that are great and helpful resources for the time being.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jen. This was great.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, happy to do it. I love helping out creative teams specifically. It's so great. Thank you all for listening to me for 2 hours. And any feedback is welcome too. I'm always looking to improve these trainings. Jesse, you had your hand up?
I didn't mean to. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Jen.
Of course,
Thank you.
everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.